All right, what you're about to watch is an excerpt of a sermon that I did for the church at Ohatch Church of Christ and was recorded here. This is a small portion of that sermon, which I thought may be relevant to you. You may find interesting. But if you'd like to see the greater sermon as a whole, it is also on the channel. And that description of what sermon it'll be will be in the description below. Thanks. Thirdly, the third example that we are given here is the person of Job. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. The whole premise of the book of Job is that it seems like all of the suffering he faces is entirely unfair. That's the whole premise. It seems like he's being treated very unfairly by God, that he doesn't deserve what he's gotten. He didn't do anything to deserve this sort of suffering. And we ask, and Job asks, why would God allow this to happen? And Job complains. And Job cries out to God in anger and frustration. But he never abandons his faith. In the midst of, in the very middle of his incomprehension about what's happening to him, he couldn't understand how God would allow these things to happen to him. Despite all these things, he clings to God and continues to hope in him. And he continues to wait. Chapter 1, verse 21. Job says famously, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Chapter 2, verse 10. His wife says to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? That is your faith in God, your loyalty to God? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" Job 16:19, "Behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high." Job 19:25-27, Job says, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin, my body, my flesh has thus been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God." There are two sources of comfort that James mentions here that we can get from Job in our suffering. Two sources of comfort. The first one, he says, "You have seen the purpose of the Lord." You have seen the purpose of the Lord in suffering. You get the advantage of knowing what happens at the end of Job. Right? If you were to open and read Job for the first time, you would walk alongside Job, questioning God, wondering why God was allowing this to happen to Job. In the middle of the book, when he's facing nothing but suffering, you and I struggle to understand what could be the purpose of God in this. But after you finish the book, you see that all along, from the very beginning, God did have a purpose in this suffering, and that purpose indeed was accomplished. He had a purpose from the start. And the point of Job is not mainly, the purpose that we see here is not mainly that Job gets everything back doubled, which he does. Except his children. He gets back the same amount of children, gets back everything else doubled. That's not the main purpose that is found in the book of Job. That's presented in Job as like a side note, right? As an aside to the main issue. The main purpose that we see here in Job is seen in chapter 42, 5, and 6, where Job responds to all of these things and said, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now, after these afflictions, after this suffering, after this struggling, now my eyes see you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Now my eyes see you." The purpose of God's suffering for Job is for Job to know God more, to see God more clearly, to bow to God more entirely. The purpose of God was for Job to know God more. And you have seen the purpose of the Lord in Job. So you can find comfort in your own suffering because God has purpose in your suffering as well. You don't exist to avoid suffering. You exist to know God. And as you have seen God's purposes in Job's suffering, you know that he has purposes in yours as well, even when you can see nothing but barren ground. And Job's submission to God here is not passive or unquestioned. He struggles with God. He is angry with God. He questions God. But the flame of faith was never extinguished. He kept trusting despite being furious and confused. James 1, 2-4 again. "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." We don't just drift into holiness. We don't just wander our way into Christ's likeness like we're wandering into a wardrobe and finding Narnia. We grow in holiness. We pursue it very often, if not exclusively, by the pathway of suffering and by the pathway of hardship, by the pathway of difficulty. And he says, the second source of comfort, to remember the Lord's compassion and mercy. That is, remember that at the end of Job, Job did get it all back, that every bad thing was undone. And every bad thing you are facing will be undone as well, that you are going to receive back far more than you could have thought or imagined.